Have reviewed the 10-minute and 12-second video of the May 25, 2020 killing of George Floyd by 4 members of the Minneapolis Police Department? 10 minutes, 12 seconds. Have you viewed it? Why haven't you? What are you afraid you will see? What are you unwilling to see? What are you unwilling to admit? Have the 4 now former members of the Minneapolis Police Department responsible for killing George Floyd in broad daylight before onlookers who also videotaped their conduct been arrested on suspicion of committing a homicide, meaning causing the death of another person, of George Floyd? Why haven't they been arrested? Who decided they should not be arrested? What message was sent when they were not arrested? The killing of George Floyd was a criminal act. There are witnesses to the act. The fact of Mr. Floyd's death is indisputable. Mr. Floyd was not threatening anyone, none of the officers nor anyone else, when he was killed. The actions of the officers were not taken or necessary to prevent him from threatening anyone. In other words, there is no legal justification for the actions of the 4 former officers who killed George Floyd. None. Period. Full stop. We should not be surprised that people around the world, including Minneapolis, are furious. George Floyd was slain by agents of the state. His killers are still at large. They have not been arrested. We should not be surprised that people in Minneapolis are outraged by statements on Thursday from local and federal prosecutors calling for patience. Patience? Why should they be patient about deliberate refusals to arrest known homicide suspects? Why should they trust a process that reeks with corruption and injustice? We should not be surprised that people are outraged by the decision of the Minnesota governor to mobilize the state militia, the Minnesota National Guard. Minnesota is not under siege. Minneapolis is not under siege. Minneapolis is not being attacked. The peace and order that the governor and local prosecutors are talking about is not threatened by civilians who peaceably protest while 4 Minneapolis police officers are at large who killed an unarmed, defenseless man who was lying under the knee of one of them on his stomach. How in the world do people conclude that the Minnesota police, the Minnesota National Guard, is somehow going to quell that outrage? Why do they believe that it's necessary to take a militia and send the militia, 500 militia people, to quell the outrage of people who took to the streets to protest the death of George Floyd and how local authorities refused to arrest his killers? Do the mayor of Minneapolis and the governor of Minnesota believe it really takes 500 National Guard soldiers to arrest 4 suspected killers? I mean, that's the real order and peace threat. There are 4 suspected killers at large who killed an unarmed man who was defenseless, who killed him in broad daylight, who killed him when they were sworn to protect his life and defend his life. And so for the governor to send 500 National Guard people to Minneapolis and talk about restoring peace and order when you got 4 killers at large suggests that the governor actually thinks that people believe that he's sending the Minnesota Guard to do something besides arrest the killers, because the killers haven't been arrested. And does anyone really believe that the fiery protest scene on Thursday evening and on Wednesday evening would have happened if the 4 suspected killers had already been arrested? Let's talk plainly. George Floyd was killed. At minimum, he was recklessly killed. At worst, he was knowingly killed. In Minnesota and every other U.S. jurisdiction, recklessly causing the death of another person is manslaughter. It's a felony. In Minnesota, state prosecutors can charge people who commit manslaughter without convening a grand jury. There is no reason to wait. Let's talk plainly. In Minnesota and elsewhere in the United States, a person who cooperates with, assists, helps to conceal, or otherwise interferes with efforts to stop a homicide is liable for the homicide as an accomplice. Each of the 4 officers involved in the homicide of George Floyd should have been arrested and charged days ago with manslaughter. The prosecutors can later seek grand jury indictments for murder if other evidence is uncovered, but there is enough evidence already in the public world mind to charge, arrest those 4 people with manslaughter. And let's talk plainly. The Minnesota governor and Minneapolis Police Department and the Hennepin County prosecutor are demonstrating their cultural incompetence. That incompetence is not merely personal, it is institutional, pervasive, pernicious, and infuriating. The same cultural incompetence happened when Breonna Taylor was killed in Kentucky. The same cultural incompetence happened when Ahmaud Arbery was killed in Georgia. The same cultural incompetence happened when a white woman named Amy Cooper falsely accused a black man named Christian Cooper, no relationship, of threatening her life in New York City. That cultural incompetence is not new. The Louisville police officers who killed Breonna Taylor in her home have not been arrested yet. The killers of Ahmaud Arbery were not arrested for months after he was attacked and slain. They were only arrested after and because a video was exposed that it chronicled how he was killed and who killed him. We should also demand that the former police officers involved in the Floyd matter be arrested immediately on suspicion of manslaughter. There is plainly probable cause for arresting the officer who held his knees on Floyd's neck. However, there is also probable cause for arresting the other officers as accomplices because of their active presence and complicity in the manslaughter, in the homicide. And few statements to date have stressed this fundamental issue. Arrests do not need simultaneous charging actions. There is no need to await charges before each of the former officers who were involved in the homicide of George Floyd is arrested on suspicion of manslaughter. There is no requirement that an autopsy be completed, that all of the toxicology exams be completed before persons suspected of manslaughter are arrested. There is no requirement that those officers be indicted by a grand jury. Each former officer should be arrested on suspicion of having committed manslaughter in the death of George Floyd. And if later additional evidence is found to show that the actions were knowingly done, the grand jury can issue indictments for murder against each of them. Prophetic people know that refusal to arrest the former officers is a political statement by the Minneapolis Police Department. That department has chosen to not arrest 4 killers. That fact must be strongly proclaimed and condemned. Prosecutors do not arrest suspects. That's a policing decision. And the police have deliberately exercised their discretion to not arrest 4 homicide suspects. Why? Because they are former members of the police department. They are cronies. So telling people to trust the process is infuriating when the process is openly working to perpetuate a blatant injustice. Stop telling people you feel their anger of people in Minneapolis, and especially the anger of black and brown people. No, you don't. No, you don't. You don't unless you have suffered this mess and you haven't dealt with it every day and night like black and brown people have. You haven't seen people be called lawless for loudly protesting of homicide, except when the victim is a person of color. You don't feel our anger. You may feel your own anger, good, but don't claim that you feel our anger or share our anger. You don't unless you have shared our pain. You have shared our discrimination. You've shared the centuries of blatant state-sanctioned slaughter of black and brown people by law enforcement officials. We know you don't feel and share our anger. Stop fooling yourselves and stop trying to fool us. And stop talking about trusting the Justice Department. The United States Justice Department is headed by William Barr, the same William Barr who decided not to charge Officer Daniel Pantaleo of the New York Police Department for choking to death Eric Garner, choking him to death. William Barr is the person who decided not to charge Daniel Pantaleo with violating Garner's civil rights. And guess what? Daniel Pantaleo has never been arrested to this day. Stop saying you feel our anger, because you don't live with this discrimination every day. We do. But we don't have to act like we like it. We do not have to put on a good face about it, and we will not do so. If you aren't comfortable with our anger and the way we express it, get out of the way. If you aren't turning over the institutions responsible for our anger and angry behavior, get out of the way. As the prophet Hosea wrote concerning the ancient Hebrew nation of Israel, for they have sown to the wind, and they shall inherit the whirlwind. This society has always sown the wind of white supremacy with its tolerance of state-sponsored terrorism and slaughter of black, brown, red, yellow, and poor white people. People of color have long known that this society shall reap the whirlwind. And the whirlwind from the seeds of long pent-up outrage about systemic law enforcement abusive and homicidal conduct has arrived now in the United States at the same time that the nation and the world are gripped by the COVID-19 pandemic, which highlights racial disparities in countless areas of life. The whirlwind from generations of corrupt and racist political leadership now has arrived when the U.S. is led by a vicious idiot, despot, racist, and sociopath named Donald John Trump. The whirlwind is here. The United States cannot, should not, and will not escape. My name is Wendell Griffen. That's my position.